The full title of this video, if I could fit it in YouTube, would be How Fans Ruin the Bonjwa Concept. There's no such thing as a Bonjwa. Now, the reason why I make the video and why I title it that way is because the concept, the term Bonjwa, is a great concept. It's a really useful one. It's one that plays a role that we never had before in esports, because we never had a term before for, like, not just the best player, not just an all-time great player, but a player with very specific kind of general definition, and who you understand once you get the concept exactly why it's significant that he wasn't just a great player or the best player even at a certain point in time. He was above that. He was the Bonjwa, something above even that. Now, the downside of it is, the reason why it's been ruined is that fans, people who've debated this and talked about it, have completely made an abomination rather of all the definitions of what they consider a Bonjwa. They've ruined the definitions of others, and there's no coherent nature to what a Bonjwa is in the collective of Bonjwas, and no consistency to how they apply the rules. Yet, if they'd been a bit more loose with it and understood the spirit of the concept, we could have easily had a few people that we all defined as Bonjwas and would go on without any kind of problem, but we'd all understand the concept and it would work, and this term would now be useful. So the basic term Bonjwa is a Korean term that essentially means the player who stands above all others. Now, there is actually a history with the name where it was actually first initially used as a nickname or another name for July Zerg, the player who won 3 OSL titles, but not in the context of him of being what later would become the Bonjwa. And in fact, in the consensus canon history of StarCraft Brood War, he is not considered a Bonjwa. So actually that was kind of taken away from him later on. The first player who was actually called a Bonjwa in the sense we're talking about now, the one player who stood above all others and who was the true champion, was the all-time great player who had that qualification, was Savior. And what's interesting is, at the time, they made it so there was 4 Bonjwas, like a Mount Rushmore of these gods, but the 3 that came before Savior had this term retroactively applied on them by fan culture. So Boxer, Nada, and I Love Uv, they all had it retroactively applied on them. While they were in their peaks, while they were in their primes, they weren't called this term. This term wasn't used. So you're already starting to see there that the way it's defined is in hindsight, and it's defined after the fact, and the consensus is very weird because it is just a consensus of opinion. It's not that there are obvious people which all the rules fit, as my video will now explain. Now, the problem in StarCraft 2, which has ruined StarCraft 2 in terms of the Bonjwa term, and it isn't used as a term, and only now have people started to kind of accept, maybe we should have accepted an MVP as one, is that all the rules that they've set up were already a problem in Brood War. They denied certain people who legitimately should have been Bonjwas from being so. But even worse, in StarCraft 2, it got so that nobody could qualify to be the Bonjwa because the rules didn't work, because there was more expansive circuit. You didn't just play in Korea, you went abroad as well. You played GSLs every single month as opposed to one every 3 months, and so the span of time didn't feel like you could dominate as much, even though you actually could accomplish more in some senses than you could in Brood War. Just the definitions were off. So okay, in Brood War there are 5 agreed Bonjwas. So there was Boxer, and I'm going to tell you the year span of when they really had the dominance that would make them applicable to potentially be a Bonjwa. So there was Boxer, the Terran player, and that was from 2001 to a point of time in 2002. Then after him, you had Nada, another Terran player, and that was, I'll give the nicknames. Why don't I? Bonjwa, Boxer was the Emperor. Nada, the Genius Terran, it was 2002 to 2003 was when he won his titles. Then you had I Love Uv, also known as the Cheetah Terran or the Gorilla Terran. Bus Driver, that was like 2003 to 2004 when he was dominant. There was Savior, who was... what actually was Savior's nickname? I guess people just called him a Bonjwa. The Maestro, I guess, was one that people had for him. There was Savior. That was roughly 2006 to 2007, even though he actually started winning earlier. And then the final one is Flash, and that was 2010, mainly 2010, but then a bit of 2011, and he was the ultimate weapon. He had a bunch of different names when he was much younger. What was he called when he was younger? Yeah, I forget that one, actually. He had a nickname when he was younger as well. Anyway, the Ultimate Weapon is the best nickname for him. Now, interestingly enough, even among those 5, the one who accomplished the most in history, actually, is Flash. But he's actually, to some degree, still debated as a Bonjwa, because then people were like, well, can't call him Bonjwa, so we'll just call him God, which is obviously a better term than Bonjwa, but then why doesn't he also count as a Bonjwa? So anyway, as you'll see as we go through this, it gets really difficult because people think they can set strict definitions, but then they haven't been consistent in how they've applied them. So, okay, the basic term, as people define it there, doesn't give you a lot of information, is one above all, the player who rules above all other players for a significant period of time. Now, a more complicated definition, when I've looked through everyone's arguments and I've studied this history quite a long time, been through years worth of threads on Team Liquid, I'd put the more complicated definition from what most people seem to be agreeing on as a player who has won multiple titles over a significant period of time and has no equal during that time period. So that is what most people think applies to the 4 Bonjwas, if not the 5 if we're including Flash, but not to other players who might meet some of that criteria, but not all of it. Now, here's the issue. You start off in this area of looking at those kind of terms, and you go, okay, so titles, so players have won multiple titles. Well, every single one of the Bonjwas has won at least 3 titles. So we're talking about MSL and OSL titles. They're the only ones that really count for this qualification. So every single one of the 5 Bonjwas has won at least 3 titles. But here's where it gets interesting already, because there's 2 other great players in history who won 3 titles. Jelizerg won 3 OSLs. Bisu won 3 MSLs. Not only that, so just the winning titles alone doesn't get you there. But even within the context of that, so titles isn't enough because Boxer only won 3 titles, whereas Jaedong won 5 titles. You notice Jaedong isn't in the list there. Not only that, mainly because of how they were spread out. So that's part of it in that particular sense. In theory, you have to kind of win them in a row, because if you look at most of those players, they won at least 1 or 2 of their titles in a row, if not like 3, like 2 in an OSL, then an MSL. So it's winning it within the span. That's why you're so dominant with your titles, because we don't count the titles you win 4 years later. So winning them in a row is a quality, but again, there are other players who would qualify there. Bisu won 2 of his MSLs in a row and made the finals of a 3rd one. Jaedong won back-to-back OSLs. Along with Boxy, he's the only player to ever do that, except actually for Jiangbi at the end of the game. But for a long time, we said that. It was a record that lasted a long time. But Jaedong and Bisu, not considered Bonjwas. So again, that doesn't quite fit it. They're trying to make it, remember. That's what point I'm making here, so that all the criteria fits. So in each case, I'm going to show you how there's other players who fit that and how some of the stars of it don't actually fit that. So okay, what about in finals then? Because here's the thing. You look at dominance, and you look at titles, and you look at winning for a significant period of time. Someone like Jaedong's career is incredible. He was in dual finals. He's one of only 6 players to ever accomplish that and won one of them. He was... Actually, let me think. Did he win one of them? No, he actually lost both of them. I forget that one, okay. So he made the 2nd most finals in history. He was in 9. Again, that doesn't count over a whole period. Most consecutive seasons with a final appearance is a record he holds. Most semi-finals in a row, most consecutive semis in a row. In fact, most semis total in a row, most semis total in history of Brood War, and most consecutive semis. So here's where we get into the problems. As I've already kind of hinted there, there's more problems to go, which is as we start to define it, just because you give the definition to one person and you like what they did there, you have to translate that to the other Bonjwas and say, well, did they accomplish that? Because that's how you're defining, well, okay, Bisu did win the same number of titles, but he didn't do this over here. Then you have to do that to all the Bonjwas. So, okay, Saviour's dominance. He was a very dominant player. He made it to 5 straight MSL finals and won 3 of the 5. But here's the problem. If you want to talk about dominance and say that some other player wasn't dominant because they won some titles but lost elsewhere, then you have to apply that to Saviour. So of those 5 seasons of the MSL where he made all of the finals, the first 4 of those MSL finals, he didn't even qualify for the OSL. Not that he didn't get far in the OSL. Other players like Jaedong, Bisu were all in the OSLs, etc. when they were winning the other tournaments, or in the MSL when they were winning the OSL. But Saviour didn't even qualify for these. He would lose in the offline qualifier to scrub guys. He wasn't even... So that hurts his dominance, obviously. Likewise, he didn't win every MSL. People get mad when someone wins 2 OSLs like Jaedong did, but then loses in the final. Well, he actually lost in the round of 8 of the next one. But people get mad there. Well, Saviour didn't win all of those. He lost 2 of those finals. One of those win very dominant fashion by Bisu, who's completely humiliated. Also, if you want to talk about dominance outside of the 2 leagues, okay, what about another play that would make you stand above all others? Yes, Saviour was very dominant in some exhibition competitions like the CJ Super Fights, but in Pro League, He wasn't one of the all-time great Pro League players on the same level as someone like Jaedong was. While Jaedong was making sick runs in OSLs and MSLs, he would be putting up those 30 kills a season. He would be tying people for kills leaders. He'd be getting all kills, reverse all kills in the Winners League section of Pro League. He was a very dominant player, one of the best Pro League players of all time, and one of the most accomplished 1v1 players of all time in the individual leagues. Likewise, Bisu won 3 MSLs, also made 4 finals total, and fantastic player in Pro League, one of the best Pro League players. Admittedly, his Pro League factor comes later on, so that wouldn't actually count for him, because his came sort of 2008 onwards when he became Super Sick Pro League. Earlier days, yes, he was more of an individual 1v1 player, so that's why he wouldn't qualify overall there. Now let's look at Nada. So Nada won the most titles in history, but again, we're only counting the period when he was very dominant to make him the Bonjwa. So we're really talking about like late 2002, early 2003. That was his best period. So the problem with Nada is, first of all, yes, some of them were in a row, but obviously some of his later titles that make him a great player, the 6 titles, some of those come years after the fact, so they don't get to count. So take those away, only the ones that count in a row now. So again, when he was winning his MSLs, they weren't actually MSLs at the time. They were all the KPGA Tour, which is the tournament that was the precursor to the MSL just before it started and eventually became the MSL. So it wasn't quite even the same caliber of competition as the MSL would later become with its format. In this world, you have to remember that for the 3 KPGA Tours he won, the first 2 over in the OSL, again, he wasn't even playing in the OSL. He wasn't qualified for the OSL. Yet, Jaedong can win OSLs, back-to-back OSL runs, win 2 in a row, and yet he's not allowed to lose to Flash elsewhere. He's not allowed to lose to Flash in Pro League, in their world. That's why he's not a Bonjwa. He's not allowed to lose in the next tournament to Flash, so he lost after winning 2 OSLs, he lost in the round of 8 to Flash in the next OSL, but during the same season, he was in the MSL final and beat Flash, so technically that's 3 titles in a row. That's better than some of these Bonjwas did, but that doesn't get to count as standing above all. Yet they're allowed to fail in the KPGA Tour, like Boxer did at times during his run, or they're allowed to fail in the OSL, as Xavier and Nada did. They're allowed to for some reason. What is used as a disqualifying point for Jaedong is somehow then not used as a disqualifying point for the other Bonjwas. That's who you're supposed to be comparing him against in terms of criteria. So in terms of I Love Uv, the great thing about I Love Uv is this Michael Jordan stat that he has, which is every final he played in for MSL, OSL, he won. So Michael Jordan in the NBA played in 6 NBA finals, won all 6. Now, I Love Uv played in 5 finals, 3 MSL, 2 OSL, and won them all. Now, that's great. Here's the problem. Again, some of those don't count. Like, for example, some of his last OSL especially doesn't count. It's years after the fact. So take that away, go to the MSLs. Okay, again, he's losing in OSLs before the final. So someone like Jaedong can make finals of tournaments, win some of them, and then lose in the other ones, or the season after make the final and lose. And he's considered a loser because he lost 4 times in his 9 finals. Yet he won the same number of titles overall as I Love Uv, 5, and then I Love Uv won 5, but he had 4 silvers as well. I Love Uv had no silvers. So in terms of dominance, that's an issue. Now, restricting it to the era again, even within the era, Jaedong's winning 3 golds in a row and then having a round of 8 fallout below that. I Love Uv wins 3 golds in a row, and he's allowed to do even worse in those other competitions. So again, it's not as simple. That's actually restricting. That's where you've taken the stats and you've tortured it to make him sound super dominant, because you're ignoring that sometimes it's better to come second than to come third or below, which is what I Love Uv did many times. In terms of Boxer, you have to remember he was entirely retroactively, essentially. For him, it shouldn't even be called a retroactive application of Bonjwa. It should be called honorary Bonjwa. Because in terms of titles, he won 2 OSL and the first KPGA Tour. So 3 overall. First KPGA Tour, I'd urge you to go back and look at the field there. He played the weakest fields of anyone. That tournament particularly was a very weak field and a very fucked up format. One of the weirdest I've ever seen. Wasn't as difficult to win as later MSLs, etc. in like the Flash, Jaedong, Bisu, Stork era, when you had to win like best of 5 series all the way in the playoffs. You had to get reseeded so that you had to play the best seeds if you weren't the number 1 seed. All sorts of things that make it more difficult to play. And also, Boxer, yes, a very brief period of time was absolutely the best, was the most innovative, had super sick micro, was winning all the tournaments, was winning all over the place, winning lots of smaller tournaments as well that aren't OSLs and MSLs. But if we're allowed to count the tournaments that aren't OSLs and MSLs, then why do other tournaments that people like Jaedong win, Like, for example, when they won the GOM tournaments or when they win World Cyber Games, why do these not get to count again into the dominance? Because remember, Jaedong won the World Cyber Games in 2009, his back-to-back OSL year, which would be his year that you would nominate for his Bonjwa year, but that doesn't get to count. Yet you're allowed to count people like Savior, people like Boxer, playing in secondary third-party tournaments, winning those and showing dominance there, and that's why it gets to count as to how brilliant they are. It's inconsistently applied again. So the big problem here is I've gone through all four of the Bonjwas. No Flash there because he applies for everything. He's one of the only players who actually fits all the criteria, believe it or not. All the other Bonjwas, the only ones who are actually the 100% agreed Bonjwas, not a single one of them fits all of the criteria that people then make a list of, and make every other Bonjwa candidate have to match up to, or they fail. And so actually, when you add it up like that, when you take away what the others all lack, it's actually entirely reasonable to say Jaedong should be a Bonjwa, that you can't argue against him, because all the reasons you'd give against him would also go against some of the other Bonjwas. And he actually has factors where he's ahead of many of the Bonjwas in many of the areas. Some of them admittedly have more, but in many areas he's better than most of them. So here's the interesting thing. It is a great term. It's a wonderful term. I love it. I want to use it more. It's the fact that people fuck with you and people will get mad at you and people say this doesn't count, and people will get religious in their fervor and their zealotry over the fact that this doesn't get to count and this all the way. Don't even say it. And then they'll use faulty, fallacious logic like, unless everyone agrees someone's a Bonjwa, he can't be one. Well, I've just shown that people are only all agreeing by holding the group delusion that this criteria fits to everyone when it doesn't. They just conveniently ignore and deny when it doesn't fit. So it doesn't work that everyone agrees. Just because everyone agrees is irrelevant. I mean, for a start off, I don't agree. So just because the consensus is the case doesn't mean that's a reasonable term. It is a great term though, and I would love it if we could apply this more, not only to Starcraft Brood War, but to Starcraft 2 and to League of Legends and to CSGO, and I will do that in future videos, but this is laying the groundwork for why I'm then going to be able to do it without people going crazy. So in terms of Starcraft 2, let's try and apply the reasonable term of what it's supposed to be to who could be in Starcraft 2 a reasonable Bonjwa candidate. So here's the way I would do it. I've got 4 names in StarCraft 2 5 names actually, that I'm willing to consider Bonjwa, and then some of them you can debate. Okay, so here's the thing. The only one I think is Ironclad, by any reasonable definition, adapted to StarCraft 2, where they had more tournaments and you had to go overseas and you had to play lots of different tournaments. The only one I think is Ironclad is MVP. He won so many GSLs. He was so fantastic for like a year and a half of excellence, of being absolutely amazing. Good in all particular scenarios. Good in nearly all tournaments. Won many, many titles. He should be the ironclad Bonjwa. No discussion there. I mean, obviously discussion. That's just a figure of speech. But as in, he should be the least debatable one. Beyond that, there's a couple where you can debate them either way. Like for me, Life could be, in terms of currently he's been the Bonjwa. The last period he's been extremely good, making all these finals, making all these deep runs, having championship wins. Of course, he's lost at times, but some of the Brood War Bonjwas lost at times. He also was fantastic at other points in time, or admittedly spread out a bit more and then didn't do as well in GSLs after his GSL win over MVP in that particular season. I think it was the 5th season, was it, of that year? I don't know. Anyway, might have been 4th. So, of 2012. So when we go back, once you've got past MVP, you're already seeing with Life we've got some concerns there. Okay, how about Tasia? Now here's the problem with Tasia. It has to be a Bonjwa in terms of mainly a foreign tournament Bonjwa. Like in foreign tournaments, yeah, I don't think anyone can really fuck with him. He won so many, it's unreal. Admittedly, yeah, some of them smaller ones. And during some periods of time during this, he would win the foreign tournaments and make a deep run in the GSL. Obviously, he never won them, but he was making the semi-finals, making quarterfinals repeatedly. So he was having a very good run. Admittedly, it's a problem that you didn't win the biggest Korean competition, so I can see there's an issue there. But again, this term has to be loosened up a little bit if we're going to do it in StarCraft 2. And if you really want to get out, let's just give him it as an honorary term, because he was so phenomenal overall. And there was periods where, at least in foreign tournaments, he was untouchable and dominant in certain ways. So we've got an MVP, we've got Tasia, we've got Life. I would say, just if you can have Boxer have an honorary title as the Bonjwa, I would say give it to MMA as well. Because, okay, he never really had a period of time where it was an extended period of time with multiple titles all in a row without losing, etc. Yes, he beat MVP in incredible fashion. Overall, it's just the whole career that deserves him to get him the Bonjwa title, a bit like with Boxer. Because just the level of titles, the number of years he's winning titles over, the consistency he had, the fact he was good in Pro League, the fact he was good at, well, the Team League, the fact he was good, he was the ace, obviously, for Slayers. Then he was good with Acer. Then he was good in all foreign tournaments. And then he was good in GSLs, making deep runs over and over again. So I think just as an honorary one, he should get it. So for me, there are 4 big names you can give, obviously, there. MMA, I'm adding. If you want a 5th one, again, I don't want to push the matter too far. But if you want to give another honorary one, the other name that obviously stands out to me as an honorary one would be Nesty. Because, I mean, the guy was phenomenal. He did win 3 GSL titles within the span of around a year. And was fantastic in other ones, making deep runs in semis and round of 8s. An absolutely amazing player. His ZVZ dominance, like crazy record he had for a long time. So, yeah, absolutely fantastic player. Admittedly, it's hard to ever say he was truly the best. Because even the season he won of GSL uncontested, he never lost a single map. People still would have said overall, over the span of like a year or that year that you'd want him to use Bonjwa. Obviously, MVP was the Bonjwa that year, so it's difficult in that sense. But if you want to give an honorary title, he's one you could give to. I don't want to give too many honorary titles, but I think those ones could at least deserve it in some way. It's hard to give anyone else them, though, because you look at the other players and there were issues. Like, okay, for a brief period of time, Deer was the monster, and then it fell away. And then Zest had a period where he looked so good, but he didn't actually rack up that many of the huge titles, like the GSL-type titles. Obviously, MC was amazing over his whole career, but then his actual period of dominance, very, very brief. So there's issues there going on. And obviously, one thing people don't take into context with all of this shit is how powerful was your race, what were the changes to it at that point in time, where was the metagame, which would be an extra discussion, but I think it's worth putting it that way. So anyway, that's my basic premise. I've kind of given the Starcraft 2 ones there. I will actually do future videos for other games for who I think the Bonjwas are, but I want to set it up first. Now, normally, this is where I'd plug an Alpha Draft thing and say play Fantasy Esports there if you'd like to. The thing is, Alpha Draft don't do Starcraft 2, so if you follow other games like League of Legends, Dota 2, Smite, etc., you can play Fantasy Esports at Alpha Draft. If not, don't worry about it.